I'm Christopher Perrin, and we thank you for attending this live webinar on the fine arts, the common arts, and the liberal arts. Can they cohere? How do they cohere? Where did they come from? And why do we call them what we call them? Or we might just say, what is the relationship between, the classical liberal arts and the fine and common arts? So just using these words conjures up questions, doesn't it? It certainly does for the participants on this call who've all written essays as a part of our quarterly question of the quarter or disputed question. And I have to just let everybody know that one of our contributors who's here tonight, Phil Donnelly, chose to use the very form of the disputed question as a way of writing his essay. In what ways do some of the great thinkers agree and disagree with a resolution? And then how do we respond to that? Very much like Aquinas and others did in the medieval period. So this is a disputed question. The relationship of the so-called common arts or mechanical arts or manual arts or servile arts to the liberal arts. And then to just make things complicated, throw in what we now call the fine arts into the mix, and then ask this question: what should classical educators and schools and homeschools do with these three collections of arts? Are these the right words, or are there other words, other terms, other ways of describing these arts and their relations? These questions are a part of what we might call the great tradition or the great conversation. As you read through the history of education, you'll find people saying a variety of things and not always agreeing. For example, Plato and Aristotle do not agree with Hugh of St. Victor on this question. Aquinas seeks to do some synthesis, and I think maybe Phil Donnelly will help us with that. So without too much more delay, I'd like to just introduce you to the panelists who are with us and just let you know that each of them have written an essay that you can read, if not now, very soon, on the disputed questions section of the Classical Academic Press website. So thank you for joining us. We will record this, and so it'll be available for posterity to view, especially if something good happens. If something bad happens, probably no one will ever hear of this again. But that won't occur. So I'm going to give our participants the order in which they can introduce themselves, but I'd like to ask you to be brief because we want to save time for you to really talk. So if you just share your name and where you serve and work, and then just one reason why this question is of interest to you, okay? So name, where you work, one reason why this question is of interest to you, and then I'll open us up with a starting question and we'll get going. So it'll be Phil Donnelly, then Junius Johnson, then Kim Williams, then John Skillen, David Diener, Chris Hall, Carrie Eben, and Christine Perrin. So Phil, that means you're first. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Phil Donnelly, and I am a professor of literature in the Great Text program in the Honors College at Baylor University. And until a year ago, I was the director or department chair, and I'm now undergoing post-administrative euphoria. And I would say these issues came to my attention, I suppose, between undergrad and grad school for a time when I worked as a carpenter, and I realized that I wasn't having the experience of getting to make things as a carpenter, and I was part of a house-making machine, and this led me into the study of the liberal arts at the graduate level as a way of thinking through some of these issues. So,
thank you, Phil. Junius.
I'm Junius Johnson, and I'm independent scholar. I'm executive director of Junius Johnson Academics, and my interest in this goes back to the fact that I'm a professional classical musician. I've been performing professionally since high school and have had a lot of very powerful and life-defining experiences while performing. And so that's led me, obviously, to want to bring that into conversation with all the other questions of meaning that I ask in every other area.
Thank you, Junius. Kim. Oh, you're muted, Kim. We cannot hear you.
Oh, there we go. Thanks, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm Kim Williams. I am a middle school art teacher at Delaware County Christian School in Eastern Pennsylvania. And this has just been a lifelong pursuit of mine as an artist, as a teacher, integration of faith in the arts. And I care deeply about that with my students, with young people. So.
Thank you, Kim. John.
I'm thinking that I'm probably the least known by others, so I'll say I live with my wife in Newburyport on the coast north of Boston. We've been there for 40 years, and I went to Gordon College nearby and studied literature from the classics to the Renaissance, and then did the same for my PhD at Duke University, and then pretty quickly went back to Gordon College and stayed there, and we like where we live, and I retired recently and had a great time as a teacher there. Part of that was about 10 years we lived in Orvieto, Italy, in the middle, and when I started and launched a semester program there that is in its 25th year. So we've spent 10 years we lived there. So if I have a lot of stuff about the Italian arts and culture, that's because why.
Grazie mille, professore. That's John. How about you, David?
Hi, I'm David Diener. I am a professor in the education department at Hillsdale College and also the executive director of the Acumen Fellowship. I'm interested in this topic, I guess, for two reasons. One is that I spent many years in K-12 classical education and 11 in administrative roles in classical Christian schools. And so I've seen ways that the common arts, the fine arts, are integrated well or badly into a tradition that's trying to recover the liberal arts. And so I care about it practically. And then also personally, I've done a variety of the common arts and fine arts my whole life. My dad was a music teacher. I've done carpentry work. So I've sung and played music my whole life and done carpentry work. Also basically my whole life, put myself through graduate school. And after doing that, and maybe unlike Phil, had actually some really humane artistic experiences doing really high-end trim carpentry and custom cabinet building and some really fine stuff that brought together the worlds of common arts and fine arts and in some really interesting and personal ways.
Well, I'd like to think that Phil did something high end too, but we'll just have to hear about that.
He said it. He said that he felt like he was part of a house-making machine, so it was sort of dehumanizing in a way.
I see. Okay,
That's an accurate interpretation.
It wasn't meant as a criticism of
understood.
his qualities as a craftsman.
And just a brief interlude here. Those of you who are on the webinar, we're going to give you a chance to introduce yourself as well in the chat box in just a little bit. So get ready. Christopher Hall, who are you?
That's a great question. I often ask that myself. I'm here as founder of Always Learning Education, an author who's written a little bit about this integration between liberal, common, and fine arts before. But for me, the big draw to this one was coming from my own experience and my experience in the classroom. I'm a K-12 educator now and administrator for 30 years. And I was a BA in philosophy. I spent a lot of time training in common arts. I grew up in a home where the common arts were. But as I got into the classroom, I realized there's a certain impoverishment in these arts amongst our kids. And we're learning the liberal arts, we're learning sciences, we're learning history, we're learning a beautiful set of things in our schools, but our kids couldn't cut straight lines and they couldn't build. And this set me on a course, 30 years ago, towards where we are right now. And this question to me about the integration of liberal, common, and fine arts, and even how we define those, is a big one for me. I would say it's a defining question. A lot of the work that I do with Always Learning Education is in propagating these arts, teaching people these, and building the liberal arts into that experience. So thank you for having me here. You're
certainly welcome, Chris. And we all know the collection of instruments behind you that kind of say it all. So I guess we could go to your tool shed and also learn a few things. Carrie, let's hear from you.
Hi, Carrie Eben. I live here in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. I am a classical education consultant, co-founded Sacred Classical Academy here in Siloam Springs, Arkansas, and I currently teach integrated humanities at John Brown University. My interest in this topic was, at first, I really was struggling with the topic about common arts. I've been in the fine arts. I'm a musician, a vocalist, so that was familiar, but the common arts were not, until this summer, I went on a little escapade herding cattle, which is what my essay is about. And it was an absolutely euphoric experience. And so I actually asked Chris Hall, I said, Chris, is this common arts? So, if I'm wrong, it's all Chris Hall's fault. So that's all I have to say. But I thought I just had such a wonderful experience. And so I just had to tell that story and write about it. And I think it fits. So
Thank you. And we know you also did ride horses and you did jumping, but that's not herding cattle, is it? So there's a distinction.
no, so that's different. I would think that, and I think I distinguished in my essay, was, dressage is almost fine arts. It's a dance, actually. It's very musical, rhythmic. But in herding cattle, that's not a fine art, but I think it's part of the common art. But I would think that, if you can get to the point where you can rope a steer, and I don't know what the proper term is, but when you're competing in a rodeo, I don't know. I think you get to be pretty, you might be able to cross the line there. We might be able to make a case for that, for fine arts, but we have a lot of people in our area and constituents at our school who do rodeo and animal husbandry and kind of live this lifestyle. And so I just think it's really important to make some connections there for our school, at least.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Maybe that'll come up in our discussions. Let's go to you, Christine. Who are you?
So my ethos comes from the fact that most everything I've ever learned, I learned either at home, even though I was not homeschooled, or from poets. And I sort of learned early on at Hopkins as an undergraduate that I wanted to learn from the people who were making the things. I did not want to learn from the people so much who were putting themselves above the makers. That's kind of the basis for me for this conversation. One more example. I was a competitive swimmer from the age of 6 to 18. And I did lots of competing, but then I took a few years off to learn ballet because it was so beautiful. I loved it so much. I just thought, I understand the beauty of this. I'm probably going to be able to do it. And I had to accept the humiliation of dancing with people that were like 4 years younger than I was, because I started late. This is one of those things you have to start at age 3. And it turns out that, no, you can't just make something beautiful by understanding deeply the beauty. But that is how powerfully it worked upon me to want to embody in my own body the beauty that I could perceive. I teach at Messiah University. I've taught with John at the Gordon and Orvieto program. In fact, it's not an accident that both of our essays mentioned at the same place. All the places that he's mentioned, I've had the privilege to go with him and hear him teach about and, educate the aesthetic and moral imagination, teaching us what a proper response is to the thing that we're beholding together based on its context. So I've really been greatly privileged, and I'm happy to be talking to all of you.
Thank you, Christine. And I'll just turn to our participants. We'd love to just know who you are. So if you wouldn't mind just saying hello and telling us, if you want, your name and where you serve, and maybe just a sentence about the fine or common arts, or this question that is interesting to you. So say hello. We'd love to see who you are and where you're from. Mary, who's at Rochester Classical Arts, beginning a Common Arts program this year. That's Rochester Classical Academy. Dawn from Dallas, coming to learn. Scott from the Geneva School in Florida. Jen, welcome from Founders Classical Academy. Joylyn Blake, welcome from Scully Academy. Katie Curtis from Rochester Classical. Brian Williams, welcome from the Templeton Honors College. Wes Moore from Westside Christian Academy. Wendy Steele, Middle School Literature and Science from Faith Christian School in Roanoke, Virginia. What a beautiful place in the country that is. Katie says, we want our kids to use power tools. Everybody wants to use a power tool once you've seen it in action. And then Kate, principal at Our Savior Lutheran Classical School in Houston. Welcome to you, Kate. Karen, upper elementary teacher from Kenai Classical School. She says, we're interested in how to integrate more common arts within our curriculum. And Whitney, homeschool mom from the Cascades. And Kate says, coming from a director of music background. Sarah, she is on the board of hopefully a future trade arts college in Michigan. Jolie Hodge is here from Classical Academic Press and an MAT graduate from the Templeton Honors College. Timothy Howard from Boston, who worked at True North Academy. Elizabeth Painter at Rochester Classical Academy as well, inspired by Chris Hall's book. Lindsay from the Fine Arts Director at the Regent School of Oxford. It's such a pleasure to have you with us. What a pool of talent you represent. So we're honored by you taking time with us tonight. Thank you for coming. Okay, so let's have some discussion. Reading through your essays, I was struck by a number of themes, but one theme that I'd like to start with and just get us going is a terminological theme. We use the word arts in various ways. And, we know that arts has reference to something made. And so what do you make with the liberal art of rhetoric? Well, you make great orations and speeches. What do you make with the liberal art of logic? Well, good arguments, we would hope. And well, what do you make, if you're involved in the visual art of sculpture? Well, that's pretty clear. We're making things, out of marble or clay. We're sculpting things that are 3D and visual. So we get that. But then we have the fine arts to describe certain kinds of arts. We have phrases like the common arts, the mechanical arts, the manual arts. And then Phil Donnelly used the word tangible arts. And Junius Johnson said, I think maybe we have to revisit our nomenclature. Maybe there should be more than 7 liberal arts, because if you think of the word free, liber free, doesn't playing music beautifully in some way free the soul. So how can we say that a kind of instrumental musical art, it would not be liberal, rather than just a quadrivial mathematical version of music? So I'll just stop there and let any one of you start with describing why we have the words we have, and maybe helping us understand a little bit of the history of this vocabulary.
I would just point out that John did speak of the history of the vocabulary in his essay. Maybe he could read us that section.
Yeah, he questioned the fine art. He was pointing out the word fine arts is a recent phrase. John?
Yes, well, that is what I wrote about, and I think that's the case. It's really, we use it all the time, but and what I suggested, and I think this is the case, is that when we when we speak of and practice or not practice, often we are sitting or standing with put hands behind our back. The fine arts do not obviously invite our own engagement, body and mind. I mean, we can look at the paintings in the museum. We can sit in the concert, but we really are there in what I think of as just really, it's an aesthetic demeanor. But I mean by that is that it's a narrow thing. We don't put anything to work as we do that. And if we like like the sonata, we can go back and whistle it or during the day. But it's really out of our active presence. So and that was maybe that's enough for starters. But I was in my little essay, I spoke about the romanticism, which also brought out the artist as the single person who does and makes what she or he wishes to do. They hope that people will somehow pay to see it, but the making is pretty much designed by the person alone. And I simply wanted to point out that that is only 2 centuries, if that much. And most of history that we know, it's a communal thing. So I'll add more there. I don't want to hog the conversation. But I think fine art simply is unwittingly a damaging term for us as we want people and art in the society to be engaged in the arts. Okay.
Could
Well,
I
follow up on that,
John?
please? Bill.
So it seems like clarification there is, although people have practiced these arts for many centuries, the particular way in which we frame them as isolated from the others as an aesthetic experience is really since the 18th century. And that's a version of the fragmentation of the transcendentals, right? That you can have beauty without truth, right? That is what's in play there. So it does seem, going back to the categories though, it was striking here, the comment, Carrie's comment about dressage, because it seems to me that would illustrate, I guess, a hypothesis I'm considering about whether, in fact, you could make a case that all the liberal arts and the manual arts have the potential to be practiced as sources of enjoyment, apart from their utility, that would make them into what we might call fine arts in principle. But there's also a way in which they do have an integral coherence among them, that we sort of, by using the category of fine arts as something that's detachable, that's what gets us into trouble. As opposed to, I think it's fine to say, if we mean by fine arts, something that we enjoy for its own sake, it's not an instrumental purpose. It still has a purpose, but it's something you enjoy for its very being, rather than for some other end. I think that's as opposed to the kind of called the post-18th century sense of aesthetic enjoyment, that you can just detach beauty from questions of goodness or truth.
Now, John, in your essay, you mentioned that, say, the beauty of an octagonal baptistry or a fresco surrounding an altar, that this kind of art was assisting, in that case, liturgy and worship. And so that there was a purpose for this art that beyond itself. And as I understand the word fine art, sometimes it has this connotation that it is its own end, it's its own finis. There's nothing at all beyond the art itself. But in the case of liturgical art, that art does have an end, which is to facilitate worship. David Diener, you've studied a lot of history and philosophy of education. As you consider this kind of etymological and terminological question, where does your brain go?
Yeah, I wanted to add one other kind of distinction as we think about these taxonomies that's relevant to what you just said. about art being used for worship is that obviously sometimes throughout the tradition, these distinctions are made in terms of studies. So, for example, Hugh of St. Victor lists, a series of what we're calling common arts or mechanical arts. That's true. You have the 7 liberal arts, and there were other lists, at different points in history. But another way to think about these distinctions, that it also goes the whole way back in the tradition, is that it doesn't have to do with what the subject matter is, but with for what it is being used. In other words, it's a teleological question. So you can do the same thing for very different reasons. The whole way I'm thinking of Aristotle in Politics 8, where he draws this distinction between liberal arts and vulgar arts, and he says what one does it for makes all the difference. So if it's done with an eye toward virtue, that's different. Or the sort of the other end of the historical spectrum, John Henry Newman in the 19th century talks about how you can study theology on the one hand for pure contemplation of the divine, or because you're a pastor and have to prepare your homily for Sunday as part of your job. And it's not that one or the other is necessarily bad or good, but those are two fundamentally different things because they're oriented toward a different teleology. So that's just, I think, a helpful way for us to think about these distinctions and taxonomies.
I think what's interesting about John's examples, and I give similar examples, but in a less specific way, although we both use the Sienese town hall as an example, but it really does away with those distinctions because you do have things like frescoes, crosses, icons, carvings, baptismals, music. You have all these fine arts, but their end is both their beauty and their use. Like it's impossible to separate them. They are there to worship, but part of their exquisiteness, their exquisiteness is part of what creates worship. And of course, this isn't just in a church or a cathedral, but in a government building, where you're meant to be thinking about issues of governance. And then John gave another example, which I didn't know, that Botticelli's Spring was in the bedroom of wealthy man's son, again, leading him towards virtue. Another example would be San Marco in Florence, where, and many monasteries, but in this one, all of the beautiful frescoes were in people's bedrooms and hallways. And so, I often, when I go there, I think about, well, why did the abbot choose this picture for this person to gaze upon, every single day of his existence? So, I really like the implosion of categories, in a sense, in those examples.
I'd like to go to Kim.
To
Thank you, Christine. Kim's essay emphasizes the importance of kind of the transformation that beautiful art brings to the gazer and the attention that it requires to think on something outside of oneself that is transcendental. Kim, as you're hearing about these definitions and taxonomies, as a working artist and a teacher, how do you process it?
How do I process the categories?
Yes. Do you want to dispute the terminology, or is the terminology that important of a question for you? Because you probably teach fine art.
Yeah, I teach fine art, but I think it borders on common arts when it's useful, beautiful things we're making, if it's pottery. So yeah, I would probably want to blur lines more as well. And consider all those categories better if they're part of a daily experience. That's forming affection for things of beauty, things of
You quote Ruskin, who says something along the lines of I would rather teach someone to learn to make art regarding the sky so that you would truly see the sky rather than to see the sky in order to make art. What's the distinction there? Could you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, I think for me, when he's saying, if I take students out to enjoy nature and they have such an experience that they begin to think about it from in other disciplines, like, and I don't even want to say disciplines, but it very much happened when we started talking about bees and drawing bees and thinking about local bees. We began to see things around us in a different light, I guess. And we weren't, it was no longer just admiring a bee for a bee, just because bees are quite beautiful, or the texture or the form or whatever. It was, what is their purpose? And how do they relate to us? And then we started thinking about this interdependence. And then it spawned these conversations that spilled over into their science classrooms. And I don't know, they just began to say, well, what can we do about it? And so this pursuit of the beautiful turned into also the pursuit of truth and goodness. Almost like I didn't write a lesson plan that did that, but that was sort of the power of letting them think and act and ask questions outside of my narrow definition of what is a fine arts classroom. Yes.
Let's go to Chris, Junius, and then Carrie. I'd like each of you to respond to what Kim has said. I think she's echoing something that Phil noted, which is if all reality is kind of an interwoven cosmic beauty, then truth should lead to beauty and beauty to truth. These things are all integrated. And so maybe sometimes we separate arts and we analyze things and we create taxonomies. We're trying to understand the cosmos, but they're all related. They're already interwoven. And so there can be kind of a danger in our taxonomies and in our taxonomy making to maybe create distinctions or separations when they might not always reflect what's real, or might lead us to fragment the kind of interwovenness of reality. Chris, how do you think about that? And then let's have Junius and Carrie share their own response to that.
I've got a couple of thoughts on that one. One is you can only understand a clock, but so far if you take it apart. And that's one reason why I'm always a little bit against dissections in biology class without observing the organism alive for at least 2 weeks before you do that. There are some things we can do with art, with nature, with creation that just take it apart. This is the danger of deconstructionism. And look at how that has changed the way we analyze everything from literature to economics in the university system across the last, 70, 80 years, probably longer. It's a huge challenge. It's part of our intellectual DNA. And I find that deconstruction, like Kim mentioned, it immediately removes the final cause. If all you're doing is looking at material and efficiency and you don't think about the final cause, you lose the poetry of everything you're looking at. A bee can be an organism that can be studied by the elements of art, but it's also one that can be observed in its hive. And having done that, I can tell you that bees are absolutely amazing creatures. Now, another set of words that we're talking about here as we're parsing out vocabulary, I listened to these words being used and I thought it'd be interesting to call them back. And I suppose this is a musical ear. I heard the words enjoyment, amusement, and pleasure when referring to arts. And I want to pull that back for a moment because the roots of those terms tell us a lot about how we see the arts. If we think of arts as pure pleasure, then we can stand there in the gallery and look at something and not let it move us very much. We're there just for the aesthetic, almost like the taste of chocolate. And that tastes good, but it's not something that might be deeply nutritious for us at the same time, right? Pleasure has a point at which it may stop. And then there's sort of amusement and bemusement, right? Two terms there that involve the muses, but one has a different connotation than the others. We can be bemused by things and be caught up in them a good bit. I was bemused by heavy metal as a teenager, right? I loved heavy metal. I don't so much anymore, right? I understand it. The cool thing was my training as a classical violinist helped me appreciate heavy metal more because a lot of those guys who were playing those guitars were also classical musicians. They understood triplets and fourths and other. It was wow. I heard these things in different ways. But I lost that amusement later as I started to dig further and further into what music is and what it does to us. And that leads me to the last term, which is enjoyment. It is hard to enjoy, to take on joy in a way that leaves out the fullness of the experience, that deep connectedness with some givenness in reality. We can be amused, we can be pleasured, but it's hard to find enjoyment, to fully enter the joy, if we don't think of these common arts as maybe a little bit less than common. When we think about the beautiful meals that we've enjoyed and the fellowship we'd enjoyed over a nice wine or a cigar, right? Or we look at the finest of clothes versus our Walmart jeans. I will go muck the chicken coop in my Walmart jeans, but I will not do that in the suits that I spent a little bit of extra money for because they're well tailored, right? Those are the things. So as we're thinking about terminology, we can look into the tradition, but I think the words that we use to connote the experience that we have with the aesthetic element of practicing these arts in certain ways are kind of important. Kim, I'm all together with you, and I loved all the essays, and every one of them was a gem in its own right. But Kim, I loved yours in particular because you're an art teacher. You're a person who not only did this from the visual point of view, but you planted that garden. You went out there and you talked about passing by the exotic flowers in the store, and you can appreciate those, but it's not the same enjoyment as that all natural, just local flowers, flora and fauna that come to your front yard as you go. And that to me is some of the best of these common arts, liberal arts, and fine arts. It's taking those elements and seeing them in ways that are not just pleasurable or amusing, they're joyful. Right? They lift us up in certain ways and give that back. I'll pause right there. Although maybe there's one more term I want to put in here, and some of you may have seen me grabbing for a marker. John, I'm going to riff off of you for a minute. John had mentioned bringing back the general notion of the arts from before the days of the art museum. And the first thing that popped into my mind is Chinese. If you look at the characters for Kung Fu, and that's them in reverse. Kung Fu, we think of as martial arts, right? Kung Fu movies, most of us of a certain age grew up with those in the 70s. That was our thing. Some of us studied Kung Fu. Chris Perrin, I'm looking at you. That's a hidden piece of your history, but there it is. And these characters are interesting because the first one, Kung, is power bigger than a person. This little radical means person, and this means power. It's an excellence. And this character here means to exceed heaven. So Kung Fu actually means dedicated energy, digging in, developing skill, refining the self, putting the self a little bit below to enter into the givenness of something, to achieve something that goes beyond heaven. It elevates us above the simplicity of the world. And I hear in some of the aesthetic responses here, Kung Fu. You can have a Kung Fu of handwriting, which I did not until my 5th grade cooperating teacher years ago forced me to relearn cursive alongside the 5th graders in that class because mine was horrible. You can have a Kung Fu of playing the bass or the guitar or the banjo. You can have a Kung Fu of many things. And I think this enters us into a certain kind of thinking about the interface between common, liberal, and what we might call fine arts, which might just be a way of describing both of those done to a certain level of excellence. One that enjoys, we can enjoy, not just pleasures or amuses.
Thank you so much, Chris. Let's go to you, Junius. Junius, you are a theologian and you're also a musician. So, and in your essay, you make reference to aesthetic experience through your own playing of the French horn. So can you talk about your own life as a musician and how that bears upon how you think about the relationship of these various arts?
Yeah. One of the things about being a performing musician is that most of the time you aren't picking what you're performing. They're just putting, you're hired to do this thing, or this is what the orchestra is doing, or whatever else. And so things are kind of set before you. And so you find yourself doing a wide variety of music that was composed for a wide variety of purposes, right? So maybe we're doing the music for the Royal Fireworks, which was written as, movie music for the King's big spectacle. And then you're going to go and you're going to do Brahms' Requiem, which is, not written for any particular person's death, but is about death in general. Not an explicitly Christian requiem, but drawing upon Christian forms. And then you're going to go and do Mahler's Second Symphony, The Resurrection, which is not for liturgical use at all, which is not a religious piece at all explicitly, and yet says more deeply powerful, says things true about the resurrection in ways that are more deeply powerful and moving than perhaps even Brahms by the time you come to the end of the fifth movement. And what's interesting to me, it's very analogous to the experience of reading books, right? I mean, I read books that are written to instruct children on how to think better, and then books that are written to tell you how to put your state together, and stories that are written to show you how to be a good person, and stories that are written to make children laugh, and all these things. And what's common in the reading of all of them is that they all address me and what's important and urgent in my life in ways that go beyond, that are not tied to what their original purpose was. Right? It doesn't matter whether The Hobbit was written to entertain Christopher Tolkien or not. It does entertain me, but it also works me over morally. It works me over metaphysically, theologically, right? I have the same experience with music, and I have that experience playing the sound of music, and I have that experience playing Mahler. And so, um, for me, I start this whole thing from the place of it's not a question of whether the music is made for liturgical purposes or for decorative purposes or whatever else. That doesn't really matter that much because it doesn't limit the power of it. The reality is it's made for human purposes. All art is made for human purposes, and all art touches us where we're human. And um, so when I think about music specifically, I think about it the way that I think about Aquinas and Aristotle and Milton and Homer. It's exactly the same conversation in my head. It's doing the same work of trying to figure out what does it mean to be in the world? How do I manage being a good husband and father and disciple and friend in the midst of my deep brokenness and sinfulness? That's being addressed by all of those texts at the same time. So then I come to the tradition, which is wanting to sort of break all these things out and apart. This one goes over here and that one goes over there. And of course, music is a quadrivial art, and so it's a mathematical art that has to talk about number. But no, but then performed music, musica instrumentalis, is actually a mechanical art, or it's a fine art, or whatever you want to call it. And I'm just thinking, what is going on? Like, those aren't two different things. It's all addressing, all of the arts are addressing what do you think it means to be human, and trying to grow, to challenge and grow our sense of that. Right. And that's why in my piece, I wanted to start with this story of just human connection that transcended language. Um, that I've experienced it in with audiences where I share a common language. It's this really the same wherever I play, but it's especially clear in that moment where there is no common language between us to address what just happened. And yet we communed over our shared humanity. Right.
I appreciate that. I want to say that it's interesting. Carrie's essay, and especially the beginning with your horse, that was probably the most. I really liked that of all of these, and I wanted to say something because what I saw there, I mean, in your essay, is that this knowing of a sort, knowing with your horse, back and forth with each other, and absolutely knowing, the little tiny, just the little movements that would move the horse. And there was something completely going back and forth with you two, right? And then, when then I want to say similarly with Kim, that it changing your garden. And I loved how you said, yeah, what was it? Create, so you took us and said the flowers and said, I admire the exotic flowers, but I would not trade them for the bustling biodiversity and flourishing stewardship of creation. And somehow the thing I was seeing in both, which really I think is sort of fundamental for me, and that is they're both Carrie and the horse, the bees and you, Kim. We were stewarding, of the nature of the people around us. So in other words, something new happened in those two. And I just see that's, it seems to me that the same way I have a very fine carpenter that I know. And, you know, when he's made the altar table in our church, and I could list the reasons why it is absolutely perfect for our church. It gathers up the history of the place, the very wood of it, the shapes of the colonial forms, and it's in that way that altar table, like the horse, it's the carpenter and the materials and the shape coming to something that is opens up I mean, a whole culture in that way. So somehow that I'm putting together a couple of things that are different. But then, so the horse, it seems to me that, oh, well, I know what I wanted to say is that then you said, Carrie, uh, in con, yeah, in a recent conversation with Chris Hall, he shared, quote, equestrian arts become fine arts when the horse and rider are in tune and can anticipate one another and work together seamlessly. But there, I mean, gee whiz, Chris, that's where I paused because becoming fine arts, that I don't get that. In fact, I disagree about that part of the sentence because it isn't making fine arts, especially as we've been developing our definitions, is that the arts are in some way they're not working. How do we say this? I mean, in the fine arts, that relation of body and other thing. In other words, when we're looking in the museum, we're not having any impact on the painter. But in these other examples, you were saying, no, it's together. And I think that's our stewardship. And I'm not sure that we need the fine arts language to explain that. That makes sense?
Well, John, it makes sense for you as a visual artist, but for me as a musician, the fine art of the performance, I'm absolutely have agency in. And the distinction between me as a performer and me and the audience member isn't so clear because I'm also an audience member of the performance, both because I'm not playing all the time, but also because I'm also beholding what I'm spinning forth. So I don't know that the um immutability of the art in the moment of encounter is really describes the whole field of the fine arts.
Hmm. Okay.
Oh, Chris, you're muted.
John, you end your essay by making reference to the museum gaze, and you actually show us an image of that. And so you have seen this, and I know it's frustrated you because you've been in the presence of some of the world's most beautiful art, and you've seen people walk by with a camera in front of their face and not even pause to look with their own eyes at that art. And so there's a kind of disembodiment and kind of a analytical and medial separation that bothers you. So
Yeah.
could it be that there are times when this does happen, Junius, when there is a kind of analytical or some kind of an intervention that separates the experience of the artifact from the human, when it shouldn't be that way?
Well, this is the thing that I think where John and I deeply agree, is that there is a culture of fine arts that is the greatest enemy to the production and proper vision of arts in our culture. Because it's what it does is it fetishizes it on the one hand, and it also marginalizes it. It's the province of the experts and the cultural elites, and we have to be, opera's in, but musicals are out. I've never had anyone be able to explain to me what the difference is between those two, and I've performed both. Um, and I do see it in performance when I go to a concert of a mediocre regional orchestra, and they give a very middling and uninspired performance of a piece of music. And at the end of the concert, everyone stands up and gives a standing ovation because that's what you do. And I just like, no, I'm not going to stand up. Actually, I refuse to say that that was an ovation-worthy performance. But and then every orchestra in the country, the New York Philharmonic all the way down, is struggling to put people in the seats.
Yeah.
Because increasingly people don't associate themselves with the culture that they believe that music is for. And so they're not going to buy the tickets and go to see that sort of a thing. This is stupid because, Phil Donnelly made me teach a course when I was at Baylor on music and great text to great text majors who had no musical background whatsoever. And I watched as people from a variety of majors and people from a variety of backgrounds, variety of musical experience, all had their lives changed by a selection of classical music that they had never encountered before, would never have listened to before. And they're clamoring for where can I find more? Is there more than I can listen to? Boy, yeah, let me tell you, there is, right? That's an artificial barrier that gets set in place. And so I think one of the things that we want to do as we go back and clean up our terms is we want to make sure to avoid enshrining that artificial aspect of the fine arts in our proper definition of the fine arts. If we're going to hold on to that term, it should have that dimension of abuse stripped out of it.
Okay, thank you. This is really interesting. And so here's what I'd like to do. Like, Carrie, I'd like you to, we've been talking about your horse, but you need to talk about that and what that experience was like and why that was meaningful. And then, David, I'd like to go to you because in your essay, you make a reference to Aristotle's view of the performance of, say, some musical arts as being vulgar. And then you challenge that and you kind of point out that's not really where we are today as Christians trying to recover the arts. We don't think that it's improper to play the lute and even to play it very well. But Aristotle said that would be vulgar and that would be what a slave should do. And I'm really interested in how you think about that and how it's progressed. So we'll let you go first, Carrie. And then, by the way, Phil, I'm queuing you up too because your essay kind of is trying to do some significant taxonomy and address objections. So you're going to have to weigh in eventually, probably towards the end. But Carrie, let's hear about that horse experience. Why was that so meaningful to you, and what did it make you think?
Well, gosh, I am such an amateur, and I was just thinking about that word, which has to do with love, right? And I'm an amateur equestrian, and I'm an amateur singer as well, but I love it. And something happened to me when I was out there herding cattle. I had been kind of in my office, in my head, working on a certain project this summer, and I needed to get out of my head. I needed to get outside. And it happened just to be this cool, beautiful day in Northwest Arkansas in the middle of July, slightly rainy. And I was asked to go herd cattle with a family from our school, and they're like a clan. They really are. I mean, it was almost like a barn, going to a barn raising, herding all these cattle. So, after the experience was over, I just was so filled with love and joy. Chris, you brought up the word enjoyment, and I was so filled and overwhelmed. I kind of couldn't stand it, and I wasn't good at it. I wasn't a good wrangler by any means, but I loved something in that moment. I loved it. And it brought me closer to, I think, my humanity, to what was real, to my purpose, to God. And so, and then this question came up about the common in fine arts. I'm like, well, maybe I do have something, to say there. But I like to recall too that Socrates talks a lot about horsemanship in many of his dialogues. And so and I thought, well, if he's talking about this as an art, it's a skill. It's and I'm just wondering, in all these things that we're talking about, whether it's horsemanship or medicine or even teaching, the art of teaching, I know how I feel after teaching well. I feel that same joy and experience and from that experience. And I wonder, and it's that working with, I think, that you were saying, John, I think you were talking about just that whole, the stewardship, the working with something and making something with, it's either making something or creating with your hands or working with a part of creation. I think there's something to that. The only thing I would, when we're talking about, should we say fine arts or should we not? I think I could make a case for either way, but the only distinction that I'm seeing between maybe a fine or just kind of pushing it over to the edge to something else is that, like, the common art, the herding, the cattle, that was really for me and my own experience. That wasn't for anybody else. That's what it did, that art or skill or whatever did for me, because I was doing it badly, but maybe when you're good at it, when you're excellent at something, you allow someone else to have that experience too. And you allow them to love and you draw them in. So I'm wondering if there might be a distinction there, whether we say fine or not, but I'm wondering if there might be something different there that we could pay attention to.
What's interesting about your essay in that respect is that the horse actually trains you. The horse who has been trained by others
Yes.
ends up training you. And so that working together is pretty remarkable that an animal becomes a contributor to your art. And Christine, I want to go to you because this is true of poetic arts, it seems to me. You make reference to how there's a kind of common communal inheritance in art that can instruct anybody at any time. And you make reference to like beautiful cathedrals and other kinds of public works of art, or people, anyone from any economic status can experience it, get it, and be blessed by it. But you're also a poet, and you make reference to being trained by poets. So could you maybe pull in the poetic arts and talk about this working together? And you learn from another poem, maybe you learn from another instructor, you learn even as you're writing and reciting your own poetry. How does this work? Horse riding, poetic arts, how are they similar? How are they not?
So the first point really fascinated me as I started thinking about this question, which is just that, we, in earlier times, people had access all the time to the fine and the common arts. It was just what your life entailed. You didn't have it so much in your home, although maybe you had the common arts in your home, but you had it in your church, in your state building, in your fountain, in your square. And it wasn't this high esoteric thing that a few people did and enjoyed. It was rather commonly available to everyone to use and enjoy. So I think that's a reversal in our culture. And that was in a culture where people weren't even literate. Now we're almost all literate, and we almost have none of that in our lives. And it's this incredible impoverishment. Like, what is the telos of literacy? But if not, to be in the presence of that beauty and to live with stories and language, liturgy, poetry in a way that could inform the shape of your life and your being. Those Ruskin quotes, to behave under it, to breathe it. But to answer your question about being trained in poetry, I hardly want to hold myself up as an example of this because, of course, I came of age in a time when a lot of those shaping devices of language were not taught. Though I will say that the whole practice was to imitate, and I think I would maybe compare it most to the experience that I had of learning how to sing Vespers tonally. I just stood next to someone who could do it. And a long time, I am a good imitator, but I just like did what they did with my voice. And now I know the tones. I can't even teach them to someone else, but I know the tones myself. I can sing by heart almost any tone, in a service. And I think that learning to write poems is a similar apprenticeship. You read them long enough, you say them, memorize them, you go over lines. That was one thing that my teachers always did with me. They would bring me in with a poem I wrote, and they would read it aloud back to me. And they would ask me, and they would exaggerate the sound. So like sometimes they would say something that didn't sound good in a really exaggerated way. Like, do you not hear this? Like, this sounds terrible. Who would say that? And sometimes it was very embarrassing. But also they would read things to me, and suddenly the whole thing would just open up, whether it was mine or someone else's, and I would have access to it because of what their bodies were able to do with that knowledge, the way they bodied forth that knowledge. So, and then of course I picked up what their bodies knew with my body, and then I bodied it back. So it really is, I think one of the reasons I don't like starting this conversation, I understand we have to start with taxonomy, but this is like very much about the body. And, the mind, of course, is well, we won't go there, but I think it's really important to look historically at how this has been a part of people's lives, and to ask ourselves why it's different now. And I would just give one example, which is Hamilton. Hamilton was a remarkable achievement, and everybody wanted to see it. And it didn't matter, what your class was, you wanted to see that. And it came from people who had studied poetry deeply, who had studied improv, rapping, which is a highly poetic form. And in the past, rapping, I never felt like I had access to it because of its content. But what Hamilton did is it gave everyone access to it, not just by form, but because of its content. So I was invited in to an art form that previously I had felt excluded from. And likewise, I think others felt similarly. So I don't think that it's absent from our experience, but I think that all the things that people are mentioning about the historical nature of it and the embodied nature of it are something that we're groping to recover.
Boy, there's so many interesting things that are now on the table, and we have another 30 minutes, and we want to leave some time for our audience to ask us questions. So let me try to put two things before us as we maybe take the next 10 or 15 minutes so we can leave some question time. And I will get to you, David, but in light of what Christine said, she's reminding me of what's in John and her essay, which is the baptistry doors at the bell tower, the baptistry door and the tower in Florence. And if I recall, on the baptistry doors, what John points out is that on those doors are all the arts, and they're not always in the kind of patterns that we might expect. The liberal arts, the virtues might be mixed in with a bunch of the mechanical arts, and they're all kind of there celebrated. So here in the kind of center of town, the object of everybody's gathering and worship, the cathedral in Florence, on those doors are represented all of this, but the taxonomy is not clear. And so I'm thinking about the number of school administrators and teachers who are on this call wondering, well, what do I do at my school? How can I can't do all of this, can I? How many of the common arts should we do? Should we have a wood shop? Should we have an orchestra? Should we teach the visual arts, the plastic arts? Shall we do singing? Shall we have tutorials? Shall we teach the violin to everyone? You can't do everything. So what do you do? And how do we order this wisely when students are, say, from age 5 to 18? So John, I want to give you an opportunity to make one more comment just about that, because you mentioned it in your essay. And then David, we will go to you and we'll let you kind of bring some philosophy to this and maybe some history.
Yeah, that all of those arts that was in the bell tower, not the doors of the baptistry, but that's okay. I just wanted to make sure there. I'm thinking about the importance of the body, and here it still strikes me that what people understand in practicing as the fine arts, and yes, even sitting quietly at the orchestra, but also where in the museum we'd lose our body. So it seems to me that if with Christine and others, and that we've described the bodiness of the art in various arts, well, then that strikes me as at odds with the very bodily deportment that we are expected to follow in many of the fine arts and many of the occasions where we would say we're going to a fine art activity. So there's a question that's where I'm seeing is we're at odds.
Thank you, John. So let's leave that tension on the table. And David, where does your mind go? And Kim, if you want to jump in here too, as a teacher of art, especially when it comes to what do we do, how much do we do, and to what degree?
Yeah, there are a lot of questions here, Chris. I think the way that you just put it about sort of what do we do or what should we teach within a classical school, that's a really great question. And if you think back throughout the tradition, many times these discussions about the liberal arts or the common arts or what we call the fine arts come up in that context. And so I think it's just a couple things to try to maybe tie a couple different themes together, is that we have to keep in mind what the goal is. And so if we're talking within classical schools about cultivating students of virtue, students who are characterized by arete, or who are able to fulfill their function as a human being well, this leads us immediately into questions of what does it mean to be a human being? And what are the ways that we can cultivate that virtue in their soul? So I mean, I'm thinking the whole way back in the tradition. You mentioned the Greeks earlier, and there's a distinction in the sense that when they talk about the liberal and the servile arts, or the liberal and the vulgar arts, sometimes they're mapping those onto the free and the slaves within their society, right? But the idea is, and you see this the whole way back in Plato, the question is, what should we teach to best orient students' souls in the right direction? And so there is this distinction that's drawn between something that's good in and of itself and something that we do merely for the sake of something else. Most people don't go out and hoe potatoes merely for the human, fulfillment of hoeing potatoes. Maybe some people do. Most people hoe potatoes because they want to eat. So the question is then, okay, once our bellies are full of potatoes, then we read poetry, then we engage in these other pursuits of leisure or scholae that are goods in and of themselves. And so this cuts across all of these physical or mental lines, some of the things we've been discussing. Plato talks about the rationale for what we would call the quadrivial arts in terms of the way that they form the soul. And he says that the study of music or harmonics is useful for the search for the beautiful and the good, but for anything else it's worthless. In other words, that's why we study it. Throughout the tradition, they cared deeply about music because of the way that it forms the soul. So there is continuity in the tradition. When you get to somebody like Hugh of St. Victor or Bonaventure, who's giving a more developed view of the common arts, again, for Hugh, this is part of the pursuit of philosophy or of wisdom. Again, so his idea is that these four different kinds of studies that he delineates, these four different aspects of the pursuit of wisdom, including the common arts and the liberal arts, are part of what it means to be a human being. So maybe if we think in those terms, I think that within the tradition there are these distinctions, but they are geared toward this fundamental question about what are we for, what is a human being made for, and what are we educating our students for? And just to draw one, to kind of close the loop on one more thinker, Joseph Pieper in Happiness and Contemplation ties this back to Aquinas, back to Aristotle, but he's talking about what the ultimate purpose of human beings is, and that ultimately happiness is found in contemplation, ultimately in a beatific vision of the divine, which we'll have not in this life, but in the life to come. And he says that this is why we need poets and artists, because he says poets and artists, this is their indispensable function, is that through them contemplation of the created world is kept active and alive. And what Pieper's tying in there is the idea that what we're talking about tonight as the fine arts, we could say, those things are indispensable for being fully human, because it's through them that we learn how to contemplate, or to have this wonder or amazement, which ultimately is that in which human fulfillment is found, which ultimately points us toward the eschaton, toward the beatific vision, when all things are made new and we see God face to face. So all of that's tying together of a lot of loose ends, but I think something that's common throughout this tradition is this question of what is the human being? What are we educating the human being for? And I think if we start with those kinds of questions, then we can get to the practical questions of what are the best ways to do this. And incidentally, not only something like music, but also we haven't talked a lot about sport tonight, but athletics and the cultivation of the body, which also is absolutely fundamental throughout the classical education tradition, also just gets a whole new sort of motivating question of why do we do this? What's its purpose?
Thank you. Then if we think of education as human flourishing, humanitas, there's a way of maybe unifying our taxonomy and not getting too caught up in the contradictions or some of the distinctions that we might want to make. Kim, what are you thinking before we go to Phil? What are you thinking as an art educator as you've been observing this conversation?
Yeah, I will just add a practical note to what you said, David, and I think that was like spot on. So at my school, my visual arts class is compulsory. Every student has to take it. I think in a lot of schools it's elective, or it's a survey, or it's something you take just for a little bit of appreciation. And so I don't teach to kids who are just talented. And I think then I can I love what Christine said too, that reminding us that the fine and common arts have somehow been extrapolated from common life. Well, I feel like what I get to do is put it back in your common life, in your common experience, and you get to think about it and act into it, not because you're talented, but because you're made in the image of God and you have the ability to be creative, and we'll pursue that, and it helps us make connections in other areas of your study. I think it would be a sad school that didn't open that room for students. Charlotte Mason uses that phrase, that the arts, the common arts, the applied arts, they provide a larger room for making all the connections that you need to make. So yeah, I think, why wouldn't you? I love that I get to teach everybody, whether they're, and some of my very favorite students are not my most talented ones, because I see the discovery that they get to walk through and the wonder they receive.
Thank you. That's so helpful. And David, thank you too for your comments and mentioning some books. And if the panelists wouldn't mind, when in the chat box, maybe mentioning some resources that have been helpful to you. Kim's just mentioned Charlotte Mason. Joseph Pieper was mentioned, Happiness and Contemplation. So if you wouldn't mind, just make sure when you type in your message, say, make sure you select to everyone so that all of our participants can see some of the resources that you would mention. I'm going to go to Phil now, but let's just mention a couple other resources. Christopher Hall's on the call. He did publish a book recently called Common Arts Education, the kind of a recovering the tradition of unifying the hands, heart, and mind in education. And he's done that. He's taught the common arts for many years and just learned by his own education and then doing it. And then Phil has written a book called The Lost Seeds of Learning, where he compares the trivial arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric as life-giving seeds, not just tools, but seeds that grant life. It's a very, very provocative book where the metaphor opens up new insights into the liberal arts. Christine is a poet, and she's written a book called The Art of Poetry. And she's published a book of her own poems as well, but The Art of Poetry is about the poetic arts. Uh, and I know Junius has just finished a course on music. Junius is also written on fairy tales. And John has published a book called Making School Beautiful. And it's about looking to the classical and medieval tradition of architecture and beauty and applying that to what it might look like in the renovation or decoration of a classical Christian school, or even the construction of a new one. So he's consulted with folks, helping them to do that. And Carrie's working on a book on pedagogy with me, and David's published a book on Plato as a great philosopher educator, and we're all working artists, liberal artists anyway, and it's just so those are resources that I'll mention too. Phil, your essay at the end, you are thinking about these matter. You're thinking about taxonomy. You're thinking about you're thinking about nomenclature as well. After having done that study, could you summarize kind of the fruit of that essay? What are the manual arts and the relationship to the liberal arts from that study?
Well, the point that I make is simply that at one level, what they share in common is that they both involve tangible making. And what's been mentioned, but I think is worth emphasizing here, is the fact that our post-industrial condition really is extraordinary with respect to human history, in the sense that we've talked about how people don't have actually knowledge of the common arts, and it might not be obvious to people that, you talked about growing potatoes. In fact, many people do grow potatoes for leisure, David. That's the weirdness of the times in which we live. And they do that because of, I believe it's because we're made in the divine image. And there's this desire to have this embodied experience, right? And that is part of our kind of being made in the image of an incarnate maker. So I think there's an underlying issue that also has been kind of going back and forth in the conversation regarding the two things that need to be kind of both distinguished and held together, which is the notion of reception and fabrication and knowledge of how to make, right? The sense of learning to attend, which is also, it's a desperate need, right? We're overwhelmed with, distractions, so that people's basic capacity to attend. And again, Charlotte Mason's great on this in terms of helping students learn to attend. But I couldn't help but think, my questions for Chris and for Kim, as well as Christine, as people who teach students to kind of do the making, there's also this preliminary side. It's like that connection in Kim, in your essay, it came up at the connection between the observation and the conservation, right? The kind of attending to the plant and then actually learning how to care for it, right? There's that dynamic, or Chris, in your case of, noticing what's there, but then also understanding the causes of how to make the thing, or, being able to receive poetry in Christine's case versus how to actually do the craft of making. And they're related, and they're actually mutually related. There's a positive feedback loop, right? Once you learn to make the thing, you attend in a different sort of way. I think, and the strangeness of our condition is that we've got many people in our culture have lost the necessity to do the common arts, and so as a result, we practice them as leisure activities, which is great, but that's kind of, we need to recognize that's strange. But then also there is this in terms of students, I think back to your question, Chris, but practical question about, well, what do you do as a teacher or an administrator? I mean, first rule, don't do what you can't, right? Then the second, observation is to do what you can, right? And that there's a way in which you have to offer student differences as well as the faculty you've got. But if you have either some, I think, necessary role, and Kim's point is absolutely, I think, on target, that there's got to be some level at which some kind of tangible making is not an elective, not an add-on, but a source of integration in the curriculum. And it could be a fine art, it could be a manual art, but at some point for the students, and they're going to be, inclined differently and with different aptitudes and interests, as well as your teachers' backgrounds and interests. So you've got to work with what you've got. But as a school, that is, I think, an integral part to have some. And the reason for this is because we live in a culture that has trained us to fundamentally disregard the relation between, in a sense, our words and reality. And that's, if you're going to do liberal arts education in a way that's not going to be pernicious, you need to have that what I call that fundamental grammatical relation in place in students' experience in some way.
And that relation is that words do relate to reality?
Yes, that they are related, they're connected in ways that are revelatory. Obviously, they different words gesture in different ways to different aspects of reality, depending on whether you're coaching football or doing metaphysics, right? But the words aren't simply self-contained things, which is the dominant model, which is the underlying assumption of a large language learning model of data science, right? The idea that words can function just by referring to one another, rather than to anything beyond themselves. But that's another topic.
Sure is. Well, thank you, everyone. We're only beginning to explore a rather multidimensional topic of how all of these arts cohere and how they can be deployed in a K through 12 classical school setting. It's going to take prudence to know how to make these decisions, to know what to do, etc., that we can't dictate from where we are sitting tonight. But we encourage all of you to engage in that. We should certainly incorporate arts, manual arts, visual arts, fine arts, if we want to use that term, into a classical school curriculum because they're human. I think David kind of was right in tying things together with human happiness, contemplation, flourishing. Well, now we have about 15 minutes left to just take some questions from you, those of you who are our participant audience members tonight. Thanks once again for coming. You'll see that there's a Q&A box, and some of you may have posted a question in the chat box. If you wouldn't mind just doing that again in that Q&A box that you see there, and then we will see it and we can read it and give it to the panel. And while you're doing that and putting some questions forth for us, Marissa, if you wouldn't mind just putting in the chat box the URL address for the disputed question. I think it's just classicalacademicpress.com/disputed question, but she'll put that there for you so you can read these essays at your leisure and also offer comments online. So please feel free to do that. There's two additional questions that have already been answered. One of them had to do with just, well, what is classical education? How would we even define it? What is it? Another discussion that Brian Williams hosted was, what about the canon of the great books? What should be included in any kind of collection of books that we would ask our students to read? And how would we make those decisions? That too is a disputed question. What do we mean by canon? Is there a list of books that has fallen from heaven, or a list of books that someone has created or a team has created that's authoritative for our time or for all time? How would you decide what goes in such a list? That was an interesting conversation. We encourage you can also view the webinar, the recorded webinar of that. Okay, I see a question has popped into the box, and so I'm going to read it. This comes from Scott Zellner. He says his I think it's stagecraft students came up with an interesting definition of what it means to be human. 3 things. He says we make art, we make altars, we use levers. We do all these things using reason. So, how do you respond, panel? Does that sound right to you? And what might you do to qualify such a definition? I'll read it again. 3 things to be human. We make art, we make altars, we use levers, and we do all these things using reason.
I think the first qualifier would be that it's treated as a characterization and not a definition, and that will be helpful, because it doesn't pick out all and only. It's telling you things that are true about humans. Maybe it's pointing to some things that are salient and essential features of humanity. That said, the second thing to point out is great students. That's a really wonderful place to wind up. But those are 3 really deep areas of human striving to reflect on, right? Our devotion to beauty that may or may not have a purpose beyond itself. The fact that we worship, whether we name the altars or not, we worship. And then the fact that we build things, technology in a very, very broad sense, right? To include codices and all sorts of other things. I wonder, is that enough to express human culture, or is there something more in human culture beyond art, worship, and technology? It strikes me as a very good start, but I would want to start probing and saying, what are some of the other really important experiences we have as humans, that aren't represented there, or are they represented there in surprising ways?
Hmm. Mhm. Well, I like the alliteration that it starts with. You know, we make art, we make altars. And I think we've got like poetry beginning, and then we use levers. So I think we need to work on that last phrase. Yeah,
Again, I would just remind you that John destroyed the distinction between art and altars. And that's part of what we've been talking about. Altars are art, right? So is that a redundant statement? I mean, obviously, and we use the levers to make them, but.
So I don't think it is. I think it's a helpful distinction, because what it means is that if you say we make altars, in other words, like Junia said, we worship, and we are sub-creators. God is a creator and has given us the capacity to be sub-creators. So we create art, but we worship something other, which is why we make altars. And then the other aspects there are the rationality and the physicality. So yeah, I think to me those 2 do say something distinct.
Without putting words in John's mouth, I think that the issue is that the self-legitimating story of modern post-romantic art is precisely the reappropriation of what becomes the fine arts as being actually something that's integral to worship and abstracting it from its original context. And I think that's the issue. I hope I'm not misrepresenting John's point there.
Which is also why we now take altars and put them in museums.
Yeah.
For that reason.
I'm thinking about that essay by Vitruvius that that's extant, that says, well, Vitruvius says that you can't build a beautiful building without having studied previously the liberal arts. That even, the great architecture requires geometry, for example, and it requires grammar, because you need to inscribe it properly with the right kinds of inscriptions and so forth. And you need rhetoric to know how to be persuasive in everything that's written and inscribed and so forth. And he just develops it, and it's quite significantly. So I'm just musing on the overlapping nature of all of these things. But before we go on with that, there's 2 more questions. And so let's go to Mary Damastro, and then Elliot Rausch. Mary asks, has anyone considered how Charlotte Mason discusses handicrafts? Is there a distinction between handicrafts and common arts? Chris, how about you? How would you answer that question?
So I was reading that question and thinking back to what I know of what Charlotte Mason has said on this, and I'm flipping through the Rolodex in my mind. Other people have asked me about this too, and it's been some good lunchtime conversation at conferences through the years. And what I gather is this: listening to finer Charlotte Mason scholars than me, Charlotte Mason is discussing essentially handicrafts in the home, doing things in the home, for the people of the home and the hearth. And those are beautiful and wonderful things. But I think common arts is a bigger and broader category for that. It was the distinction that was made once over a very fine lunch at an ACCS conference was Mason is pretty much thinking about this in terms of primarily the home and the hearth and the development of manual skills, right? What we think of as that. But the notion of common arts in the grand scope of the tradition, as say Milton would treat it, or as Hugh of St. Victor or Bonaventure would treat it, is something much bigger. It's something that's almost theological. It's theological at its root. We're participating in a grandness of reality, a givenness of reality, that it's good to teach our children is A, there, and B, good to conform to use Ken Meyer's words from years ago on this. And I think that Mason had kind of the notion of home and hearth and the beauty of community and family and the skills, of course, all that's there. But I think this notion of common arts that maybe I talk about in the book and a number of us here have discussed is a little bit bigger. It's a bigger in scope. Even if, let me put a caveat on that, it finds application in the same ways, because cooking and tailoring and weaving and leather crafting and all these other pieces do beautify the home, and they do enhance our lives and do make them better. There's an aesthetic as well as a practical use for these things. So it's a fine line distinction, but that's what I gather from a couple of finer scholars of Charlotte Mason than I.
Could I add a note there? When I read that, I thought it's simply a case of two things. One is that handicrafts arguably just names a species of what are traditionally called common arts. And also handicrafts are what you call those things in the wake of industrialization and the rise of something called fine arts, right? That's what happened historically. Yeah.
Thank you, both of you. Elliot asks, I think, a fascinating question. I'm interested in how the panel will answer it. Are there any postmodern artists or expressions of art that are affirmed by the classical tradition? And that might mean like the current renewal. Those of us who are part of renewing the classical tradition in these postmodern times or postmodern times, whatever times we're in, do we affirm any of this art, specifically in the classrooms? And are there, and more specifically, are there modern examples where high culture art and low culture pop art synthesize and can be used for educating a child? So this would be a great question for Kim, who's you're teaching art, looking at art, and teaching the history of it. I'm sure as part of what you do. How have you approached this question?
I use Charlotte Mason picture studies every day, and there's so many things I love about them. One is the habit of attention that it forms and teaches them to read the language of art, if you will. But I don't buy Charlotte Mason curriculum. I don't necessarily want to look at all, like when I look at the images that she chooses, I want to choose others because I don't personally limit my own self to a narrow category of art that I enjoy or that I think is important. I try to, two things I do is we look at art, sacred art during Advent and Lent, and those are our favorite time of the year to look at art. So I look at, we look at Cimabue, or we look at, I'll show modern, currently alive artists, right? If it's communicating what I want them, things I want them to understand, or things that I want to form in their hearts. And then otherwise, I'm not even trying to walk them through a chronology. I'll often just something might relate to the project that we're working on in class. But yeah, I wouldn't say I have art that I would add to the canon necessarily. Someone else might. I don't particularly do that. Not that I'm not particular about what I show them, but I would draw lines. There's things I wouldn't show them because I don't think they're necessary for them to know probably. But yeah.
John, I think you'd be also interesting to hear on this. Thank you, Kim. I've seen a lot of variety in responses because I'll just take Mako Fujimura as an example of a really good modern working artist who happens to be a Christian and whom you would not kind of place in kind of the classical school, but knows the classical school and is doing something new with some fusion of Japanese techniques and classical techniques. But John, this is something you studied because you've been in Orvieto. You led this program for a long time where you were studying the ancient and medieval traditions of making beautiful art and looking at it. And yet you would bring in some working artists into your program who are sometimes doing some modern art. So how would you answer that question?
Well, briefly, I think I turned to a very close friend, but also a widely known artist, and that's Bruce Herman. What I can say is that over the last maybe 6 years or so, he really is turning to commissioned work, murals, and portraits. So in other words, he is working out from developing, art from out of his own, imagination, and making art that in fact is already asked for by other people, and that it will be in public places. I could come up with a picture I can quickly, is that he has a very large crucifixion. I mean, it's about 20 feet high. I mean, it's a big thing that is for uses in altars at churches. It was there for some weeks, months. I mean, in our church, the Anglican church in nearby, and that was profound. And so he's doing things that are for public, that is called for anyway. So that's just a way that he's turning from a postmodernism that is in fact earlier.
Someone that my students really love is Jim Jenkett. They love it when I choose his work. I don't know who's familiar with him, but it's very narrative, and it's lovely to walk through it Advent and Lent. I would love to show Bruce or Ed Nippers.
Yep.
Can't really do that. That's another conversation. But I'd love to walk them through Bruce's work, or it's just more mature, I think, than my middle schoolers could handle.
I got the impression that the question Brian raises, what does the question mean by postmodern? I got the impression that the question was asking contemporary art. Is there, I think it's a question about nostalgia, perhaps. Like, how is it that these principles and this history and this past, these riches, are they only something in the past, or are we able to deploy what we've learned from them and gathered from them in our evaluation, in our enjoyment, in our use, you could say, of things that are being made now? And I can say for myself, absolutely. Richard Wilbur said that Frost was the last poet that had a culture that was listening to him, which I think is a very interesting question around what we're talking about, implying that, artists used to believe they had a relationship to the people that were viewing them or listening to them, and that fell off. And that's one of the reasons that poetry has become so esoteric and unreadable, and uncommunicative, because no one's listening anymore, and everyone knows that. In my essay, I said that I was 35 before I read a poem to people who knew me, because someone at my kid's school asked me to do it. And I felt so exposed, like, oh my gosh, they could judge whether or not this was good or whether or not it had anything to do with their lives. But anyway, I would just say in answer to that question, I've mentioned Hamilton, another poet that it would be Tahimba Jess, I think Marilyn Robinson. I think there are people writing right now and alive right now who are worthy of study in classical schools. And I think I'm curious about whether or not that's happened anywhere else. I think it's a great conversation for us to be having.
Yeah, if I could just add to that real quick, I mean, I think Jordan's made exactly the right point here is, chronological snobbery is not limited to any point of the timeline. I don't think that there's any time period in human history that can be written off. And so you're looking at art and artists on a case by case basis. That's what we're always doing. And you're going to find beautiful things and horrible things in all the places. And one of the challenges often with postmodern art is that it's often so irreverent, to the point of blasphemous that it can be very hard to find stuff that's age appropriate, for people. But the stuff is there, and that's not a problem with it being postmodern. That's a problem with that particular artist or that particular piece of work. So, for the most part, I wouldn't put Salman Rushdie in front of kids, even though he ticks off the boxes of pop culture at the same time as high culture, uniting those things and whatnot. But his Haroun in the Sea of Stories is magnificent, and I would feel comfortable putting that in front of kids, because his political issues are not at play there. He's just writing a great story, right? So I think we have to just say, it's not really that helpful to know that it's postmodern or not. What's helpful to know is it true? Is it good? Is it beautiful? Does it have meaningful relationships to those things, which we have to remember the medievals taught us a negative relation is a meaningful relation. The negative exemplum, the ugly, the foul, the false, and the evil can be helpful in demonstrating what the true, good, and the beautiful are. And that's why some of our syllabi have Nietzsche on them.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too that, some postmodernists have been willing to consider the past again, whereas the modernists were kind of writing it off. So there was a kind of postmodern playfulness with the past, and then pulling the past into the present in some playful kind of relations. And sometimes that's been really interesting in both visual art and literary art. But as Junice points out, sometimes it's just atrocious. And right now there's kind of a probably it's complicated, but I think Junice is right. If it's true, good, and beautiful, if it edifies and elevates the human soul, it should be considered. But a lot of great classical work gives us the sensibility, hopefully, to discern that in the present as well. And then to Christine's point, and we probably have to wrap up, we'd go on and on, but yet when do we decide to include some contemporary artists, whether literary or visual, into a classical K through 12 curriculum? This is another disputed question, and we touch on it in the question about the canon. We know some books are great because they've stood the test of time, but in this period, there are probably some great works being written. We just don't have enough time to assess them to know for sure. But could we perhaps take a chance on what we think are some very good books, even if we don't proclaim them great for all time? And I think Marilyn Robinson is an excellent example, like Gilead. It's a marvelous book, in my opinion. Christine has convinced me of that. But we probably have to be careful about how many of those good books we do put in the curriculum. But that's another question of prudence. All right, well, there's a lot of open questions. We have not resolved these questions that have come before us for all time, but the discussion needs to be had, and it needs to continue. What do we make of the liberal arts, the fine arts, and the common arts? And how do we properly and wisely deploy them in a classical K through 12 curriculum? Thank you for joining the conversation. It will continue. We appreciate your time tonight. God bless you, and peace. Thank you, everyone.
Well.